They say that at the edge of death, the truth can no longer hide. It isn't about myths or conspiracy theories. Sometimes, reality is far more unsettling. In the stillness of a private moment, Pope Francis, aged, frail, but lucid, uttered something that would leave even the most devout shaken. With a fragile voice and tears in his eyes, he said, "Jesus wasn't who we thought he was. He was much more." And then he fell silent, as if the weight of centuries pressed on his chest. What had he seen? What had he come to understand in those final moments of clarity? Picture the scene. A dim room inside the Vatican, far from the flashes of cameras or the bustle of cardinals, the air heavy with incense and unsaid truths. In his trembling hands, a weathered crucifix. His voice cracked, not from weakness, but from reverence, maybe even fear. What knowledge did he carry that couldn't be preached from the pulpit? What hidden truth was never meant to echo through the walls of a cathedral? Today, we step beyond the veil. The words you're about to hear might reshape the very image you have of Jesus. This wasn't part of any sermon, no press release, no official record, just a moment shared between the Pope and a young, trusted priest, a man who never expected to bear a secret so heavy. At first he said nothing, bound by loyalty, by fear, by awe. But something changed. Maybe it was a dream, maybe a sign. Whatever it was, he could no longer remain silent. And now, for the first time, you will hear what the Pope whispered before everything changed. "Holy Father, do you believe Jesus was ever afraid?" The question lingered like an unsung prayer. The Pope didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained locked on the old crucifix hanging just above the flickering candlelight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost broken. He feared not death, but our blindness. He cried more within than what Scripture dares to show, and not for himself, but for us. The young priest swallowed hard, unsure if he should press further, but Francis went on. "I saw him, not in a dream, I think. No, it felt too real. He looked at me, and he wept. Was it a vision? A divine encounter? Or something deeper? Something spiritual that defies categories? Whatever it was, it left the Pope shaken. The question was no longer whether Jesus suffered, but whether his suffering was far greater than any of us could grasp. That night, Pope Francis didn't sleep. He sat in silence, his fingers tracing the faded margins of a Bible that had seen more tears than sermons. One verse echoed louder than the rest, and he began to be sorrowful and deeply troubled. Matthew 26:37. It wasn't just Scripture anymore. It was a cry, a memory, a wound. He closed his eyes and the vision returned. The Garden of Gethsemane, dim, heavy, still. But this time, it wasn't the solitude of abandoned friendship. It was something cosmic. Jesus wasn't simply alone. He was carrying the weight of every broken thought, every silent scream, every shadowed heart. "I saw him cry," Francis whispered. But his tears never touched the earth. Angels trembled as they caught them in their hands. Then came the final blow. "Each tear," he said, "had a name, and one of them was mine." What could that possibly mean? That our lives, our wounds, our regrets, are etched into his tears? What if what Pope Francis saw wasn't just a vision of Christ's pain, but a revelation? That Jesus didn't merely die for us, but with us. That every tear he shed was a mirror of our own. In the days that followed, something shifted in Francis. He requested access to the deepest vaults of the Vatican library, manuscripts shrouded in secrecy, scriptures excluded from the canon, personal letters from martyrs whose names had faded from history, and visions buried under layers of theological silence. Among those fragile scrolls, he discovered something that would undo everything he thought he knew. A passage, handwritten by an unnamed disciple, whispered, "Through time, the Master told us there would be ages when his image would be reshaped, made royal and clean, while his sorrow was forgotten." That sentence haunted him. It wasn't blasphemy. It was a beacon, a warning across centuries. We had crowned Jesus, but silenced his tears. We dressed him in gold, while his hands remained calloused. Francis, deeply moved, turned to his confidant and said, "We have made him into an icon to admire from a distance, but he still walks among the broken, barefoot chim and bleeding love." This was not rebellion, not some modern revision. It was a cry from the soul of the Church itself, a call to return, to see Christ not as a relic, but as the living God who still weeps, not because we sin, but because we've forgotten how close he truly is. One quiet evening, deep in the stillness of the Santa Marta Chapel, Pope Francis collapsed to his knees, not from sickness, but from something unseen, something that pressed on his soul with unspeakable weight. "Lord," he whispered, "show me what I've yet to grasp." And then, something happened. It wasn't a vision in the traditional sense, not a miracle for the world to witness. It was something deeper, recorded only in the private pages of the Vatican's sealed journals. A soft light filled the chapel, not blinding, not glorious, but steady, present. And in that moment, the Pope saw him, not Jesus the ruler, not the triumphant Messiah, but a man, wounded, tired, yet radiant with a love that cut deeper than any doctrine. Then came the words, not to his ears, but to the very core of his heart. "I did not come to be understood. I came to be accompanied." Francis wept uncontrollably. In that sacred moment, he finally understood. His mission wasn't to guard a system. It was to echo a heart that still breaks for us. The man tasked with leading millions now saw himself as something far simpler, a mirror, a vessel, a follower of the man of sorrows. In the days that followed, Francis called 2 cardinals into a private room. No records, no official audience, just trembling words shared behind closed doors. One of them, cautious and analytical, finally asked, "Holiness, are you saying Christ still suffers?" Francis looked up, his voice barely audible. "He does not suffer history. He suffers now, with every grieving mother, with every child abandoned, with every soul that prays and hears nothing in return. He is there." This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't revision. It was revelation. A Jesus who doesn't erase pain, but enters it. Who doesn't wait at the end of the road, but walks each step beside us. Francis wasn't rewriting truth. He was returning to it, to the face of Jesus that doesn't hide behind stained glass, but kneels beside us in the dust. And that was the secret he carried, not one for pulpits or proclamations, but a truth so sacred it could only be spoken in whispers. The cardinals exited that dim room in silence, their faces pale, as if they'd glimpsed something that shifted the ground beneath them. One left behind a written account, preserved under lock and key. The Pope spoke to us not as a man preparing to die, but as one who had already crossed the threshold, no longer afraid of death, only of what is left unspoken. That night, Pope Francis did not sleep. Instead, he walked the long halls of the Vatican alone, reviewing every choice, every word, every moment he had lived under the weight of the papal crown. And as the moon cast pale light through the windows, one truth settled into his heart like a stone in still water. He had served the institution, but now he must serve the man, the real Jesus, not the image, not the symbol, but the living Christ, hidden in the hungry, the lonely, the abandoned. He commissioned a letter, not public, not official, not even addressed to the church. It was a sealed confession to be opened only after his passing. In it, he wrote with trembling hand, "Jesus did not come to be worshipped in fear, but to be followed in love. We have gilded the cross, but forgotten the weight it bore." Each sentence was a cry, not against faith, but for its renewal, for a rebirth of devotion not rooted in grandeur, but in broken bread and shared suffering. But not all within the Vatican welcomed this silent revolution. Whispers began to rise. Some claimed he was endangering tradition. "He weakens the image of the Messiah," they warned. "He humanizes what should remain divine." But Francis stood firm, because he had seen what they hadn't. And once you've looked into the eyes of the bleeding Jesus, you cannot pretend anymore. In one final, unrecorded mass, just a few gathered souls, no press, no ceremony, Francis lifted his eyes from the altar and said something that would be etched into memory. What if he came back today, and we didn't recognize him, because we're waiting for a king, but not our brother? The chapel fell into a silence so deep it seemed to absorb time itself. No bells rang, no voices stirred, just a quiet that echoed eternity. Some wept openly, others sat frozen, as if trying to process something too large for words. A few simply didn't understand, but all of them felt it. Something had shifted. The Pope was no longer speaking from the grandeur of his office, but from a wound, and from that wound he planted a seed not of doctrine, but of presence, one that would only bloom after his absence. Not long before his health declined, Francis visited a child stricken with leukemia. It was supposed to be a short moment, a gesture of kindness wrapped in protocol, but it became something else entirely. The child, pale and curious, looked up and asked, "Does Jesus' heart hurt like mine?" Francis knelt beside him, took his hand, and with tears in his eyes said, "Yours and his beat as one." From that day on, something in him broke, but beautifully. His homilies slowed. His words were no longer shaped by expectation, but by intimacy. He no longer reached for applause. He reached for hearts. And when they didn't understand, he didn't push. He simply wept for them. Then came the retreat, a quiet stepping back, a man preparing for the veil to be lifted. He spoke less, prayed more, and just before his final decline, he handed his secretary a sealed envelope. "This must be shared when I'm gone," he said quietly. "Jesus still wants to speak." In that document, he described a dream unlike any other. He dreamed of Golgotha, but not the ancient hill surrounded by Roman soldiers. No, this was different. The cross stood in the center of a modern city. Cars passed, screens glowed, people rushed by with earbuds in and eyes fixed on their devices. And there, in the middle of it all, Jesus hung, alone, unnoticed. "I saw him crucified not 2,000 years ago, but now," Francis wrote, and no one looked up. And then came the line that left even the most stoic among his staff shaken. "Jesus looked at me from the cross and said, 'They did not forget me out of ignorance. They replaced me with entertainment.'" No one in the room spoke. No one even breathed loudly. Was it a dream? Or something more? A revelation? A warning? A final plea from a voice we no longer pause to hear? Because if Jesus truly walks among us, hidden in plain sight, the question is no longer whether he's here, but whether we still have the eyes to see him. The document also revealed something deeply personal, a secret prayer Francis whispered each morning before the world awoke. It wasn't found in any liturgical book. It had no stamp of tradition or approval. It was born from silence, from sleepless nights, from tears no one saw. It said simply, "Lord, if you return today in flesh and blood, would you be recognized or crucified again?" It was not a prayer of comfort. It was a prayer of confrontation, a mirror held up to the soul of a distracted world, because Francis had come to understand what few ever dare say out loud. Jesus doesn't need an army of defenders. He needs witnesses, not champions of doctrine, but carriers of his wound. Francis, in the slow unraveling of his health, in the stripping away of applause and status, had become one, not through position, but through pain, not through strength, but through surrender. And his final request was simple. It was not carved in stone or inscribed in stained glass. It was left in ink and tear stains. "Do not remember me as the Pope. Remember the man who wept with me." Jesus is closer than we think, but he no longer speaks in thunder. He speaks in whispers. And he added one last plea. Listen to him, before the noise of the world makes us deaf forever. Since that day, the letter has stirred ripples far beyond the Vatican walls. Theologians have dissected it, skeptics have dismissed it, and some within the church have quietly tried to downplay it. Was it a revelation, a poetic vision, or the final fevered thoughts of a man nearing eternity? But those who truly knew Francis, those who walked with him in the quiet hours, who saw the toll that unseen battles had taken, believed something different. That moment wasn't about collapse. It was about clarity. He didn't die speaking of apocalypse. He died pointing to awakening. His vision wasn't about the end of time, but the beginning of love. Today, that sealed letter rests in a private vault, under careful guard, but pieces of it have leaked, not as a scandal, but as a whisper passed from heart to heart, in quiet seminaries, in hidden chapels, in candlelit rooms. People repeat his words not to stir controversy, but to awaken something forgotten. Because the real question isn't, did Jesus speak to Francis? The real question is he speaking to you right now? And are you listening? Look not to the grand, look not to the shining. Look around you, at the worn face of a parent working 2 jobs, at the empty seat at dinner, at the silent weeping in the next room. In those places, Jesus waits, not on stained glass, but in skin, not in applause, but in ache. Maybe what Pope Francis revealed wasn't a private message from heaven, but a timeless truth hidden in plain sight. That Jesus is not asking for worship from afar, but companionship on the road of suffering. And now, more than ever, his final echo lingers like smoke in the soul. Do not adore my image, accompany my cross. That is the heart of everything Pope Francis revealed. Christianity is not a religion of statues, but of hearts. Hearts that beat in unison with the Master. Jesus is not distant, not a figure locked away in ancient texts or high temples. He is near, in the breath of the weary, in the gaze of the desperate, in the quiet cries of your own soul when words fail. At the end of his life, Pope Francis understood this truth fully, and so he was not afraid to depart. He was not leaving behind a world of symbols. He was returning to the one who had always been with him, even when the world was silent. And you, are you ready to return too? You may not remember every detail of this story, but let one thing stay imprinted on your heart. Jesus does not wait for you on cold altars or distant thrones. He seeks you in the shadows of your darkest nights. If you listen with your soul, he will speak. What Pope Francis revealed was not a prophecy about the distant future. It was a revelation meant for the present, for you, right here, right now. And if you felt something stir within you as you've read these words, do not ignore it. It is his whisper, drawing you closer. Share this story, not for me, but for the one who is still calling your name. Subscribe, comment, and above all, listen, because Jesus still has much to say.